August 1952, Spaso House, Moscow. The afternoon light slants through the tall windows of the United States ambassador's study, catching dust motes in the still, heavy air. The room is a portrait of diplomatic order. Leather-bound books, a grand desk, the scent of polished wood and old paper. All is quiet, save for the low, methodical hum of a vacuum tube radio on a side table. Its dial is turned, not to a broadcast frequency, but to a silent, searching sweep. A US communications security officer moves slowly, deliberately. In his hands, a rudimentary field strength meter. His eyes are not on the instrument, but on the ornate wooden crest hanging on the wall behind the ambassador's desk. The Great Seal of the United States, a gift from Soviet schoolchildren 7 years prior. The eagle's wings are spread wide, carved in fine-grained oak. The radio hums. The officer's gaze narrows. He switches off the radio. The hum dies. He switches it on again. A faint, anomalous modulation ghosts through the speaker, a whisper of resonance that has no business being there. It only occurs when the radio transmits on a very specific, high-frequency wavelength directly at the seal. His fingers trace the polished wood. They find no wires, no seams, no power source. He signals for silence. Carefully, with tools laid out on a velvet cloth, he begins to detach the seal from the wall. It is heavier than it should be. In the hollow of the carving, behind the eagle's beak, his probe touches not solid wood, but a thin, taut membrane of skin. A tiny metallic cavity lies beneath. No battery, no wires, no transistor. Just a silent, dormant chamber of metal and air waiting for the correct signal to bring it to life. For 7 years, it has hung in this room of secrets, an ear open to every conversation, powered by nothing but the radio waves beamed at it from a van parked outside. The most advanced listening device on Earth. And it is Soviet. The discovery in that quiet study did not happen in a vacuum. It was the direct, ingenious product of a global struggle that had turned diplomacy into a battlefield of shadows and silence. In the aftermath of the Second World War, the alliance that had defeated Nazi Germany shattered into two tectonic ideological plates: the capitalist West, led by the United States, and the communist East, under the Soviet Union. By 1946, the lines were drawn. Winston Churchill's Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri gave the division a name, but George F. Kennan's long telegram from Moscow provided the grim operational blueprint. Kennan, a US diplomat, described the Soviet Union as a regime driven by perpetual insecurity and ideological hostility, one that could not be dealt with through normal diplomacy. Coexistence, he argued, would be a permanent state of political warfare. In this new Cold War, the front lines were not marked by trenches or barbed wire, but by the chancery walls and residential compounds of embassies. These diplomatic missions, protected by international convention, were in reality castles under siege. They were the ultimate high ground for intelligence collection. From their windows, attachés could observe military parades, count new tank models, and track the movements of the political elite. Their teletype machines hummed with encrypted cables, carrying assessments of economic health, political stability, and military intention. For the intelligence officer operating under diplomatic cover, the embassy was a forward operating base deep inside enemy territory. Conversely, for the host nation, the embassy was a fortress of secrets to be breached. The Soviet security apparatus, a vast machine refined by paranoia and state terror, viewed every foreign mission as a nest of spies. The KGB's first chief directorate, responsible for foreign operations and intelligence collection, dedicated immense resources to this task. Their mandate was absolute: penetrate, monitor, and compromise. Surveillance was omnipresent. Networks of informants surrounded embassy staff. Maids, chauffeurs, and cooks were often KGB assets. Microphones, or jukki bugs, were seeded everywhere imaginable, in walls, furniture, telephones, even in the plaster of the ceilings. The American embassy in Moscow and the ambassador's residence at Spaso House were the crown jewels of this clandestine battlefield. Securing them was a near impossible task. Every piece of locally sourced furniture, every gift received, every repair made by Soviet workers was a potential vector for a listening device. Standard procedure called for sensitive conversations to be held in secure rooms, often interior spaces without windows, or while playing loud music, or while walking outside in the embassy garden. But the assumption of being under constant auditory siege was a psychological weight every diplomat carried. It shaped what was said, where, and to whom. The goal for the KGB was not merely to overhear, but to create a climate of silent intimidation, to bend the diplomatic process itself through the fear of exposure. It was within this atmosphere of profound mutual suspicion that a unique opportunity presented itself to Soviet intelligence. In the summer of 1945, with the war in Europe just ended, a gesture of friendship was extended. A delegation from the Soviet Young Pioneers, a state youth organization, visited the US ambassador, W. Averell Harriman. They brought a gift, a large hand-carved wooden plaque of the Great Seal of the United States. It was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, a symbol of the wartime alliance. In the spirit of cordiality and in accordance with diplomatic custom, Harriman accepted it gratefully. He had it mounted proudly on the wall of his private study at Spaso House, the room where he would hold his most confidential meetings. The seal was more than a symbol, it was a Trojan horse. Concealed within its seemingly solid core was a masterpiece of espionage technology, a device so advanced it would defy Western understanding for years. Its creator was not a mere technician, but a genius whose life story was itself a product of the Cold War's dark irony. The creation of this device required a mind that could bridge the gap between theoretical physics and practical espionage, a mind the Soviet state had already captured and put to work in its secret laboratories. The mind behind the device was Lev Sergeyevich Terman, known in the West as Leon Theremin. A brilliant Soviet physicist and inventor, Theremin was already famous for his eponymous electronic musical instrument, played by moving one's hands through an electromagnetic field without physical contact. In 1928, he had dazzled America with his demonstrations, a symbol of Soviet technological prowess. But in 1938, under shadowy circumstances, he was forcibly recalled to the USSR. He did not return to acclaim. He vanished into the Gulag system, his expertise deemed too valuable to waste in a labor camp. By the late 1930s, he was working in a sharashka, a secret research laboratory staffed by imprisoned scientists and engineers. It was within one such closed institute, Special Prison Laboratory No. 1 of the NKVD, that Theremin was given a singular problem. The KGB's audio surveillance teams were frustrated. Conventional hidden microphones of the time required power sources, batteries that eventually died, or wires that could be traced during a physical sweep. A device that could transmit continuously without a direct power source and remain undetectable to the crude counter-surveillance equipment of the era would be a revolutionary advantage. Theremin's solution was an elegant leap of applied physics. He designed a passive resonant cavity microphone. The device was stunningly simple in construction, yet conceptually brilliant. It contained no electronic components in the conventional sense, no transistors, no amplifiers, no batteries. At its heart was a small, hollow metal cavity, acting as a capacitor. One wall of this cavity was a thin, flexible metallic membrane. When sound waves from a conversation struck the membrane, it would vibrate minutely. These vibrations altered the volume of the cavity, which in turn changed its electrical capacitance. The genius lay in its activation and power. The device was, in effect, a radio receiver and transmitter combined into one passive element. A KGB operatives in a van parked near Spaso House would beam a strong, continuous radio signal at the study window, tuned precisely to the resonant frequency of the cavity inside the seal. This incoming radio wave would energize the cavity. The subtle changes in capacitance caused by the vibrating membrane would then modulate the reflected signal. The van would capture this reflected, modulated signal and, by filtering out the original carrier wave, extract the audio captured by the membrane. The device itself was just a piece of tuned metal and skin. It drew all its operating power from the external signal. It was a technological parasite. This made it virtually undetectable. Standard bug sweeps of the time involved searching for power sources, wires, or radio transmissions emanating from a device. The thing had none of these. Unless a counterintelligence team happened to be broadcasting on the exact frequency needed to activate it, and simultaneously listening for the faint modulated return signal, the bug was invisible. Fabricated with precision, the device was embedded within the carved oak of the Great Seal. The membrane was crafted from a thin, conductive material hidden behind the eagle's beak. The antenna was the seal's own gilded frame. It was a perfect fusion of Renaissance-level craftsmanship and cutting-edge 20th century physics. Sometime in late 1945, after Ambassador Harriman had departed and his successor, General Walter Bedell Smith, had taken residence, the device became operational. For 7 years, through the final months of Stalin's rule and into the early Cold War, the thing listened. It heard ambassadors' candid assessments of Soviet leadership. It captured discussions of US policy positions. It absorbed the casual, unguarded remarks that often reveal more than formal dispatches. The intelligence flowed to the KGB's processing center, providing a rare, clear channel into the innermost thoughts of American diplomatic leadership in Moscow. Its success was a quiet triumph for Soviet technical intelligence, a testament to the ruthless ingenuity born in the Sharashkas. But no secret, no matter how perfectly concealed, lasts forever. The integrity of an intelligence operation is often fractured not by technological failure, but by human betrayal or procedural luck. The story of The Thing was about to enter its final exposed chapter. On one side of the wooden seal were the listeners. Theirs was a routine of patient, invisible labor. In a nondescript van or a nearby apartment, KGB technicians of the 8th Chief Directorate, responsible for government communications and cryptology, would man the equipment. Their task was to activate the seal and harvest its secrets. They knew the schedule of the ambassador, the likely times for sensitive discussions. They would beam the activating signal, capture the modulated return, and record the audio onto reels of magnetic tape. The voices they heard were not abstractions. They were the voices of men like Ambassadors Smith, Alan Kirk, and George F. Kennan himself, who returned as envoy in 1952. The listeners became intimately familiar with the timbre of their targets' voices, their frustrations, their informal candor. They were anonymous clerks in the great ledger of the Cold War, turning spoken words into intelligence reports that would ascend the chain of command to the desks of the KGB leadership and ultimately the Politburo. Their success was measured in silence and continuity. On the other side was the discoverer. While often attributed to the broader efforts of US security teams, the discovery is most closely associated with a British radio operator and intelligence asset named Peter Wright, later of MI5, and the on-site US communications security officers. The initial tip-off remains shrouded, one of the most tantalizing intelligence mysteries of the early Cold War. The most credible theory points to a Soviet or Eastern Bloc defector, perhaps someone within the technical directorate of the KGB or a sympathetic Polish intelligence officer, who provided a fragment of information that the Americans were being listened to through a gift, a wooden piece. This vague clue was the first thread. The task of pulling that thread fell to the US mission's security team in the tense summer of 1952. The officer conducting the sweep that day operated not on a general suspicion, but on a focused directive. He knew what he was looking for, if not exactly what it was. His tools were primitive, a standard receiver and a field strength meter. The breakthrough came through systematic, patient testing. As he swept the room, he noticed an anomaly, a re-radiation of a test signal. The seal was acting like a radio reflector, but only when hit with a specific frequency. This was the clue that broke the case. The moment of realization was not one of dramatic excavation, but of cold, technical certainty. He understood the principle almost immediately. The device was passive, powered remotely. The psychological impact on the American team was profound. It wasn't just a bug, it was a fundamental rewriting of the rules of technical surveillance. For 7 years, their most secure room had been a transparent vault. The thing was not merely an incremental improvement in microphone design, it was a paradigm shift. To understand its marvel, one must consider the state-of-the-art in 1945. Covert listening devices, or wireless microphones, were in their infancy. They typically consisted of a miniature microphone, a vacuum tube amplifier, and a low-power radio transmitter, all powered by a battery. These sets were bulky, had limited operational lifespans, dictated by battery life, and emitted a constant radio frequency as RF signal that could, in theory, be detected by a receiver tuned to the right band. A thorough technical surveillance countermeasure, TSCM sweep, though uncommon at the time, could find such a device by hunting for its RF emissions or its power draw. Theramin's device obliterated these constraints. Its core innovation was the use of a passive, non-linear resonator. The cavity, when hit with the correct frequency from the external illuminator, became energized. The sound-modulated capacitance variation then used the principle of parametric amplification to alter the reflected signal. In essence, the bug used the energy from the incoming radio wave to power itself and send the audio back. This had two revolutionary consequences. First, it was cryptographically silent. It produced no emissions of its own. It was, for all intents and purposes, a piece of decorative metal until interrogated by its specific external key. This made it immune to the standard non-linear junction detectors and spectrum analyzers that would come later. In 1952, such detectors did not exist because the threat they would detect did not exist in Western understanding. Second, it had an unlimited operational life. With no battery to degrade, no active components to burn out, it could sit dormant for decades, ready to be activated. It was the perfect sleeper device. The only vulnerability was physical discovery. The technological shockwave that hit the US and British intelligence communities upon its full analysis cannot be overstated. It proved that the Soviets were not merely copying Western technology, but were capable of breathtaking, original innovation in applied physics for espionage. It immediately rendered all existing secure room protocols and sweeping techniques obsolete. A new arms race had begun, not with louder weapons, but with quieter listeners. The discovery of the thing was simultaneously a stunning intelligence failure for the West and a catastrophic operational compromise for the Soviets. This duality forms the core of our next angles. The operational life of the thing from 1945 to 1952 represents one of the most significant, sustained intelligence failures in Western Cold War history, and conversely, one of the Soviet Union's most potent technical victories. The failure was systemic. For 7 years across 3 ambassadorial administrations, the most sensitive room in the American diplomatic mission in Moscow was comprehensively compromised. The intelligence harvested would have been of inestimable value. It provided the Kremlin with unfiltered, high-level American perceptions of Soviet post-war intentions, internal Kremlin politics, and Western alliance dynamics during critical moments. The final consolidation of Soviet control over Eastern Europe, the Berlin blockade of 1948-49, and the early strategizing around the formation of NATO. The victory for the KGB's 1st Chief Directorate and 8th Chief Directorate was not just in the information gathered, but in the psychological and procedural leverage it granted. Knowing the American ambassador's precise reading of Soviet moods allowed for more nuanced disinformation and diplomatic pressure. It potentially revealed the red lines and points of flexibility in US negotiating positions. The bug turned diplomacy, a game of careful signals, into a game of exposed hands for the Americans. The Soviet success was a testament to their patience, their understanding of diplomatic protocol, using a gift as the vector, and their willingness to invest in long-term, deep-cover technical operations. The Western failure, however, was rooted in a fundamental technological blindness. In the immediate post-war years, US and British security services were primarily focused on traditional human intelligence, HUMINT, threats, and the known technology of wired microphones and active radio transmitters. The concept of a passive, externally powered device was outside their operational model. Security sweeps, when conducted, looked for the wrong things. The very success of the device created its own protective cloak. Because it was undetectable by their methods, its continued existence reinforced the false belief that their countermeasures were effective. The cycle was only broken by a human factor, the defector's tip. This underscores a timeless intelligence truth. The most perfect technical system is often vulnerable to the unpredictability of human allegiance. The discovery of the thing in August 1952 sent a seismic shock through the US intelligence and communications security establishment. Analysis of the device at facilities like the US Army's Signal Corps labs or the nascent National Security Agency, NSA, revealed a terrifying new domain of vulnerability. It immediately launched a frantic, two-pronged response, damage assessment, and the creation of new defensive doctrines. The first task was to understand the full scope of the breach. Cryptanalysts and intelligence analysts combed through years of cable traffic and policy decisions, trying to deduce what the Soviets might have learned and how they might have used it. This was a grim retrospective exercise. The second, more forward-looking task was to prevent it from ever happening again. The thing single-handedly catalyzed the modern science of technical surveillance countermeasures, TSCM. It became horrifyingly clear that any object, any piece of furniture, any structural element could harbor a passive device. Truly sensitive conversations could no longer be trusted to any room that had ever contained an uncontrolled item or been accessible to host nation personnel. The solution was the Sensitive Compartmented Information Facility, SCIF. These were rooms constructed from scratch with US materials under continuous US guard, with shielded walls, often copper mesh to block RF signals, acoustically treated and powered through stringent filters. Every component, from the concrete to the light switches, was vetted and installed by cleared personnel. The embassy itself was no longer a safe space. Security now required a fortress within a fortress. Furthermore, the incident directly fueled advanced research into nonlinear junction detection and sophisticated spectrum analysis. If a device could be activated by an external signal, then a countermeasure could scan an area by broadcasting a spectrum of signals and listening for anomalous remodulations, hunting for the thing's technological children. This cat-and-mouse game, born in the Spaso House study, would escalate for decades, moving from diplomatic halls to battlefields. The principles of passive sensing and remote activation pioneered by Theremin would find echoes in later technologies, such as the radio-controlled improvised explosive devices, RCIEDs, that would plague later conflicts. The battle had shifted from finding power sources to understanding the hidden conversation of radio waves themselves. The quiet discovery in the study was merely the prelude. The true climax of the story lay in the meticulous forensic analysis that followed, as Western scientists took the device apart and confronted the full, alarming genius of its design. This moment of revelation forms the turning point of our narrative. The Great Seal, now a piece of evidence rather than a diplomatic ornament, was carefully packed and removed from Spaso House under conditions of extreme secrecy. Its journey was not announced to the Soviet Foreign Ministry. No protest was yet lodged. The immediate American imperative was not diplomatic confrontation, but forensic understanding. The device was rushed out of Moscow, likely via diplomatic pouch, to a secure laboratory where the West's finest signals intelligence minds awaited it. The primary site for this technical autopsy is believed to have been at the headquarters of the Armed Forces Security Agency, AFSA, the immediate predecessor to the National Security Agency, NSA, at Arlington Hall Station, Virginia, or a similarly secure US or UK facility. The initial examination by the on-site security officer had revealed the basic truth: a cavity, a membrane, no wires. But the full, devilish elegance of the device only became apparent under laboratory conditions. Engineers and physicists, men who understood radar theory and resonant circuits, gathered around it. They began a systematic deconstruction. The first step was external analysis. The seal itself was X-rayed, revealing the internal structure without physical intrusion. The images confirmed a hollowed-out chamber within the thick oak. The antenna connection to the gilded frame was mapped. Then, with surgical precision, technicians began the physical dissection. The wood was parted not with force but with the care of an archaeologist unveiling a relic. They extracted the core apparatus. Before them lay a device of stark simplicity, a metallic cylindrical cavity, machined to precise dimensions. One end was sealed with a taut membrane, a thin skin of conductive material. A small, protruding rod served as the antenna coupling. There were no circuit boards, no vacuum tubes, no batteries. It was inert. To the untrained eye, it could have been a piece of a carburetor or a component from a pressure gauge. Its very innocuousness was its most sophisticated feature. The true climax of this story is not an explosion or a battle charge, but a series of silent, dawning realizations in a shielded laboratory. The scientists applied external signals across a range of frequencies, monitoring the device's response with oscilloscopes and spectrum analyzers. They hit the resonant frequency. It began to reflect the signal, but when they introduced sound, a tap on the membrane, a spoken word near it, they saw the modulation appear on their scopes. The inert metal was singing. The principle became clear. Modulated backscatter. The device was a radar target that could talk. The Soviet Illuminator van acted like a radar transmitter. The bug was the target, but unlike a simple aircraft that reflects a clean echo, this target subtly altered the reflection based on sound waves hitting it. The returning signal carried an audio fingerprint. The power for this entire process came entirely from the inbound radio wave. The bug was a perfect parasite, a technological vampire that fed on the energy sent to probe it. This realization was a profound intellectual and security shock. It meant that any object in any room, a painting, a lamp, a chair, could be turned into a listening post, requiring no maintenance, emitting no trace, waiting indefinitely for its activation signal. The concept of security in an electronic age had just been fundamentally and terrifyingly redefined. The secure room was dead. The only truly secure space was now one that was electromagnetically sterile, physically controlled from its very foundations, and constantly monitored for illicit illumination. The Cold War had just entered a new, more invisible phase. The laboratory analysis provided technical certainty, but it also presented the US government with a monumental strategic dilemma: how and when to react. The handling of the discovery would become a delicate game of diplomatic chess, where revealing the knowledge was as powerful a weapon as the knowledge itself. With the technical analysis complete by the late autumn of 1952, the United States government possessed an ironclad case of a staggering long-term breach of diplomatic security. Yet no immediate protest was made. For nearly 4 more months, the Americans sat on the discovery. This delay was not born of indecision, but of cold, calculated counterintelligence strategy. To publicly reveal the bug immediately would alert the KGB that their most prized technical operation was compromised. It would also reveal that the West now understood the principle of passive resonant cavity devices, a secret the US and UK were now desperate to protect for their own future use. Instead, the period between August 1952 and the public confrontation in the spring of 1953 became a season of intense, silent activity. The intelligence services, primarily the CIA and MI6, worked to exploit their newfound knowledge. They conducted elaborate deception and Fed operations. Knowing the seal was compromised, sensitive meetings were moved elsewhere, but occasionally, officials would stage conversations in the study, conversations laced with carefully crafted disinformation designed to mislead Soviet analysts on specific points of policy or capability. The room that had been a source of intelligence loss was temporarily turned into a channel for strategic deception. Simultaneously, security teams across the Western Alliance initiated frantic, secretive sweeps of every other embassy, consulate, and sensitive office worldwide, searching for similar devices. The assumption was that if the Soviets used this technology once, they would use it elsewhere. The search parameters were now updated. They were no longer just looking for active transmitters, but for anomalous physical objects that could serve as passive resonators. The paranoia was institutionalized, and justifiably so. The moment of diplomatic confrontation was finally chosen with precision. On May 2nd, 1960, the United States presented the Great Seal bug to the world, but not in Moscow. The venue was the United Nations Security Council in New York. In a dramatic public session aimed at countering Soviet denials of espionage following the U-2 incident, unveiled the carved eagle before the global press. The device was passed around for diplomats to examine. It was a masterstroke of public diplomacy, a tangible symbol of Soviet subterfuge used to undermine their moralizing. But the real private diplomatic protest had occurred years earlier, in 1953. When US officials finally confronted their Soviet counterparts in Moscow, the reaction was telling. The Soviets did not issue a blustery denial. They did not claim it was a Western plant. According to accounts from American diplomats present, the Soviet representatives were visibly confounded. They were prepared to deny standard microphones, but the technical description of the passive device left them flustered. They requested detailed technical specifications, which the Americans refused to provide. The Soviet bafflement was genuine, in part because the operational personnel of the KGB were likely as stunned as the Americans were. Their perfect weapon had been found. The higher political echelons may have been informed, but the mid-level diplomats tasked with crafting a rebuttal had no script for this. Their silence, their technical curiosity was an admission in itself. The turning point was thus multifaceted. Technologically, it marked the end of an era of naive electronic security. Diplomatically, it provided the US with a potent, permanent propaganda tool. But operationally, it was a draw. The Soviets lost a priceless asset but protected the core secret of the technology's principle for a time by the West's own desire to mimic it. The Americans regained their security but were forced to acknowledge a 7-year blindness and embark on a costly, endless defensive battle. The climax was not a victory, but a mutual unveiling. The moment both superpowers stared into the abyss of the other's technical ingenuity and saw their own reflections staring back. The unveiling of The Thing was not an endpoint, but a genesis. It set in motion a cascade of consequences that would reshape the architecture of global espionage and echo onto battlefields thousands of miles away. The aftermath of this discovery would be measured in shielded rooms, advanced detectors, and a new kind of silent war. The immediate, tangible aftermath of the Great Seal bug discovery was the radical transformation of the physical and electronic landscape of Western diplomacy and secure communications. The incident served as a violent wake-up call, leading to the institutionalization of paranoia as standard operating procedure. No longer could security be an add-on, it had to be the foundational principle of any space where secrets were discussed. The first and most visible consequence was the SCIF revolution. The sensitive compartmented information facility evolved from a rare, specialized room into a mandatory standard for all US government agencies and allied partners. Embassies around the world, particularly in hostile or sensitive capitals, underwent massive, expensive renovations. Dedicated, modular secure rooms were built, often as self-contained pods within existing structures. These vaults were constructed with layered defenses, copper or steel mesh. Faraday cages embedded in walls, ceilings, and floors to block all radio frequency signals, acoustic damping to prevent laser microphone eavesdropping from outside windows, independent power supplies with line filters, and even measures to prevent data leakage from the faint electromagnetic emanations of computers and typewriters, a discipline later codified as tempest shielding. The second consequence was the birth of a new professional discipline, the Technical Surveillance Countermeasures (TSCM) specialist. These were not just security guards with radios, they were engineers, former radio operators and physicists trained to think like the enemy. Their toolkits expanded dramatically. To hunt for devices like The Thing, they needed illuminator transmitters of their own and highly sensitive receivers to detect the faint modulated backscatter. This led to the development of nonlinear junction detectors, NLJD. These devices send out a microwave signal that causes semiconductor components in hidden bugs, even if turned off, to re-radiate a harmonic frequency, revealing their location. The TSCM sweep became a complex, ritualistic process, conducted regularly and after any breach of physical security. The very presence of these specialists and their equipment within an embassy became a powerful deterrent. The third, more subtle consequence was a profound shift in protocol and trust. The assumption of compromise became default. The practice of going outside to talk became commonplace. The White House lawn, the gardens of 10 Downing Street, and walking paths at Camp David became the preferred venues for the most sensitive conversations, not for leisure, but for security. A practice famously used by presidents and prime ministers throughout the Cold War. The gift that had housed the bug cast a long shadow. All gifts to diplomatic and governmental officials from non-allied nations were subjected to intense, destructive examination, often being dismantled in secure laboratories before ever reaching the recipient. Trust was no longer placed in objects, only in controlled processes. For the Soviet Union, the aftermath was one of operational adjustment and continued innovation. The exposure of The Thing was a setback, but not a defeat. It proved the viability of the passive principle. Soviet and later Russian intelligence continued to refine the technology, miniaturizing it and experimenting with new materials. The KGB and its successor agencies simply shifted their focus. If embassies became hardened fortresses, they would target softer locations, hotel rooms used by traveling diplomats, the homes of mid-level officials, conference centers. The arms race did not slow, it diversified. The discovery also likely fueled internal security paranoia within the Soviet bloc, leading to even more draconian counterintelligence measures against their own populations and allied diplomats, reinforcing the climate of fear that was a hallmark of the regime. The story of The Thing, however, transcends the confines of embassy walls. Its true, lasting legacy is found in the translation of its core principle: remote, passive sensing and activation, from the world of peacetime espionage to the battlefields of proxy war, where it would take on a new, more lethal form. This technological lineage leads us directly to the hills of Afghanistan. The technological principles crystallized in The Thing did not remain confined to the silent war between intelligence agencies. They bled into the overt, brutal conflict of the Soviet-Afghan War, 1979 to 1989. This was the natural evolution. Technologies perfected for espionage are invariably adapted for military use. The core concept, a passive device activated and interrogated by a remote radio signal, became a cornerstone of the electronic battlefield that defined that conflict. For the CIA's Office of Technical Service and the Pakistani ISI supporting the Mujahideen, the challenge was immense: how to monitor and interdict the Soviet war machine in a vast, rugged country. Human intelligence was difficult and dangerous. The solution was a suite of sophisticated sensors, many of which were direct descendants of the passive, resonant principle. The most famous of these were the remote battlefield acquisition systems, often disguised as rocks or debris. These were seismic and acoustic sensors that could detect the vibrations of convoys or the low rumble of helicopter rotors. But more advanced versions incorporated passive radio receivers. These devices, scattered along high-traffic passes like the Salang Highway or near Soviet air bases, would lie dormant. They contained no active transmitter that could give away their position. Instead, they would listen on a preset frequency, waiting for a coded, wake-up signal broadcast from a CIA or ISI aircraft, such as a high-flying Lockheed U-2 or a covertly operated reconnaissance plane. Once activated by this external radio signal, a direct parallel to the KGB van illuminating the Great Seal, the sensor would briefly transmit its collected data before returning to dormancy. It was a battlefield application of the same parasitic power and activation model. The Mujahideen, trained by ISI and CIA operatives, would emplace these technical eyes and ears, allowing for the precise planning of ambushes and the tracking of Soviet troop movements without a single scout needing to maintain a constant, vulnerable watch. Conversely, the Soviet experience of having their own masterpiece weapon turned against them in Afghanistan bred a deep institutional obsession with electronic warfare, EW, and signals intelligence, SIGINT. The KGB and GRU had seen the devastating effectiveness of Western-supplied technology. In response, Soviet forces in Afghanistan deployed some of the most advanced EW assets of the era. Helicopters like the Mi-8 SMV and dedicated aircraft like the Il-22PP Koot-B jammed the radio bands used by the Mujahideen for communication and critically for triggering remote devices. They employed direction-finding equipment to locate rebel transmitters and sensor beacons for destruction. The Soviet First Central Research Institute, heir to the Sharashka tradition that produced The Thing, worked tirelessly to develop countermeasures to the very technological progeny their own invention had inspired. This cycle of measure and countermeasure escalated throughout the 1980s. It created a new dimension of warfare where control of the electromagnetic spectrum became as critical as control of the high ground. The Soviet soldier, already battling an invisible guerrilla enemy, now also fought an invisible war of waves and signals, where a seemingly empty rock formation could be reporting his position, and where the airwaves were a contested, jammed mess. The psychological weight was immense. The environment itself had become hostile and intelligent. The ultimate tragic blowback of this technical arms race manifested in a more sinister form: the improvised explosive device, the IED, with radio control. The simple, devastating concept of using a commercial radio or a modified garage door opener to trigger a bomb from a distance is a crude, brutal cousin to the precise espionage tool. But the underlying lesson that a small, hidden, passive object could be given lethal agency by a distant radio signal was one the world learned from the pioneers of passive resonant espionage. The Mujahideen's use of IEDs, often triggered by modified radio signals against Soviet convoys, was a dark, practical application of the radio wave warfare paradigm. It was a democratization of the assassination tool, moving from the hands of state intelligence to those of insurgents. Thus, the legacy of The Thing is a direct line from the ambassador's study in Moscow to the mountain trails of Panjshir. It helped create a world where conflict is fought not only with bullets and bombs, but with silent, waiting sensors and invisible signals. A world where the battlefield itself is wired for sound and for death. The story of the Great Seal bug is more than a historical anecdote of espionage. It is a foundational parable for the modern age, illustrating a permanent shift in how power is projected and security is maintained. It invites a final philosophical reflection on the nature of secrecy and trust in a technologically saturated world. The Great Seal bug, The Thing, endures in history not merely as a clever spy device, but as a profound symbol of a philosophical shift in human conflict. It marks the moment when trust in the physical world, in the solidity of a wall, in the privacy of a closed room, in the innocence of a gifted object, was irrevocably shattered. It announced that henceforth the most potent threats would be those that leverage the unseen forces of physics itself, hiding in plain sight, powered by the very energy used to search for them. Its legacy is a world of permanent, low-grade suspicion institutionalized into protocol. The skiffs, the TSCM sweeps, the destruction of gifts, the walks in the garden, these are all rituals born from the trauma of that discovery in 1952. They are acknowledgements that the environment can be weaponized against the mind, that secrecy requires not just locks and guards, but an entire engineered ecosystem capable of repelling invisible invasions. We live in the architectural and psychological world that the Thing helped create. Yet the deeper reflection lies in the cycle it ignited. The device was a masterpiece of defensive ingenuity turned to offensive purpose, born in a prison laboratory from the mind of a man whose own life was a casualty of the paranoia he helped feed. Its exposure then fueled an entire industry of Western defensive technology, which in turn was adapted for offensive use in proxy wars, which then bred new generations of electronic countermeasures and asymmetric threats. From Spaso House to the Salang Pass, the same principle of remote, passive interaction echoed, evolving from an ear into a trigger. This is the central, sobering truth illuminated by the carved wooden seal. In the contest between intellect and security, every breakthrough in concealment mandates a breakthrough in detection, and every new method of detection inspires a more profound method of concealment. It is an endless, recursive loop. The Cold War was not just an ideological struggle, it was an engine of technological duplication, a mirror house where each side relentlessly refined the other's darkest innovations. The Thing ultimately speaks to the paradox of the spy. It represents the pinnacle of operational success, years of undetected access, and yet, in its discovery, it achieved something perhaps more powerful. It taught its adversaries exactly how to think. In laying bare a new principle of eavesdropping, it forced the West to mature, to abandon complacency, and to enter a new, more sophisticated and wearying phase of the long struggle. The silent cavity in the wood did not just listen to history. By its exposure, it altered history's trajectory, setting the tone for a century where wars would be fought as much with oscilloscopes and algorithms as with tanks and rifles. In the end, we are left with the image of two objects, a majestic wooden eagle, a symbol of a nation, and the tiny metallic ghost hidden within it. Together they form a perfect metaphor for the Cold War and its enduring shadow, a grand narrative of ideals and power, forever haunted by the quiet, relentless and ingenious whisper of the void.